Okay, hi. Let's talk about vampire books. So I decided to reread Twilight this year. I binged Twilight and New Moon, and I got halfway through Eclipse and bailed. During this reread, I kept thinking of how much I didn't like the vampires in Twilight. And that kind of started having me question, do I like vampires and have I read a good vampire book? Because I have read Dracula and I hated it. I hated it for reasons that I think maybe wouldn't bother other people. I found the part 1 to be interesting, and then it really tapered for me. For me, you couldn't have Dracula without the sexism, because the sexism was the plot. So I can generally overlook isms when it's not central to the book. So everyone has a different line. That seems to be my line. Dracula did not work for me. I also found it horrifically boring. I also tried the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and I didn't even get to the vampires. Grady Hendrix just really is not for me. I also read The Dowry of Blood, which is more of like a romance, and I didn't like that either. And then I've read a few erotica, reverse harem vampire romances, and I didn't like those either. So then I started thinking, do I just not like vampires? But that's not true, because Buffy the Vampire Slayer is one of my favorite shows of all time. But I didn't love it for the vampires, I loved it for the character arcs. But then it had me thinking about the vampires, and I did like the vampires, and what I think about vampires conceptually and how they're seen in culture is that they have pretty heavy pros that are balanced by pretty heavy cons. So in the Buffyverse, a vampire cannot see the sun and they will die. That's a pretty heavy con, but on the other side, if no one kills you because you're also very hard to kill except for the whole sunlight thing, then you're basically immortal, which is a good plus. So I think it's kind of interesting to see how a creator of a work is going to power a vampire, because if you do something get rid of all their cons, then they become very overpowered very easily. So I was willing to go across genres. Vampires can show up in fantasy, they can show up in romances, they're all around. So let's get into the books that I read for this experiment, because I really wanted to answer the question of, do I like vampire books, and can I find one I like? So I just want to preface by saying I am going to be talking about how the vampires are powered, and some of that stuff can get introduced rather late in the book. So if you find that non-plot related thing to be a spoiler, skip the book or skip the video. But this was kind of my experiment to figure out what kind of vampires I like. So that's why I want to talk about it here. So the first book I read was Slaying the Vampire Conqueror, and this is a romantasy. And I've talked about this in my romantasy challenge, so I kind of did it for both. The thing about this is that the whole vampire concept was completely glossed over. Did the sun kill them? No idea. We had battles, we had things going on. The sun came up as a problem at one point, but they never had issues because of being vampires. For me, the vampires didn't really work here. It was just to call them a magical creature as opposed to actually power them as a vampire. Because from the context of being a vampire, if you're in a book like this where the vampires, Slaying the Vampire Conqueror, he is a vampire king attempting to conquer a foreign land, there should be a con with the fact that you're a vampire. The fact that you might have some sort of issues with light, that you might have specific ways that they can attempt to kill you, should come into play. and it didn't really. And so for me, like the whole vampire thing was just a mask that was worn to say I'm a fantasy creature as opposed to actually being an interesting vampire. The vampires in this had a culture and they came from a different land and they were a different species, but in terms of like the power dynamic of being a vampire, it was lacking. And then I read Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and I really liked this one. It's my favorite that I read on the list, which is surprising given the kind of low reviews on this, and I did not like her book Mexican Gothic, so that was exciting that I ended up liking her here. So this is an alternate universe Mexico City, so it gives urban fantasy, which I think like that seedy city, like vampires come out at light, anything can happen while you're in a city, like that really works for me. So this is an alternate universe in which vampires have always existed, but here they have been a different species. So they are not people, humans don't get turned into vampires, and there's different subspecies. So every continent, every like area has different species of vampires. And they got outed at some point, and now they're getting slowly banned from different countries and different territories, which I really thought was interesting. I liked that aspect. I thought that there was a really interesting conversation around colonization and like colonial ideology through the use of different types of vampires, because the vampires in Europe have been kind of told they can't be there. They've been kind of banned. And so now a lot of them have come to Mexico and are taking over this territory as if it's theirs. So you can see the allusions to real life. I liked the explanation of vampires being able to go into the sun. I found this to be a trend where in most of the books that I read where vampires aren't going to just burst into flames in the sun, but they do have sensitivities. In this book, the more pale species have more sensitivity to the sun, which the maths. I think that for me, one of the things I'm learning is I like the vampires in culture are like kind of alluring. Like there's like a sexiness to them. There's like, and I think that's why they show up in romances. They're kind of written to be this like mysterious, dark sort of character. So when that allure aspect is missing, I don't think I'm as drawn in. And that was here. She's like this, like your protagonist vampire is, she's kind of messy, but the guy that she meets who's a human is like really drawn to her. I really loved the interaction between vampires and humans here. There's the governmental aspect of them trying to be banned, but then there's like the real life aspects of like how humans and vampires interact and like the types of bonds that they can have. And the concept of feeding on a human, not necessarily meaning the killing of a human, though it can if you don't control yourself. I also liked that with the different species of vampires, they were powered differently. So every species of vampires that you meet along the way have different cultures, have different like origins, and then have different powers that are associated with them, and some they use for more nefarious means than other. So yeah, overall, I enjoyed the book a lot. I read it very quickly. It was very action-packed and fun, and for me, it was the urban fantasy vampire book that I think I was looking for. But then I kept reading. Okay, the next one I attempted to read was Woman Eating. This is a literary fiction, like more like contemporary. It takes place in London, I think, and you're following a vampire character. I DNF'd this. I think I DNF'd it for reasons that have nothing really to do with the vampirical aspects of it. It's so funny because when I started my channel, I was definitely a literary fiction reader. I was more snobby about genres, and now I like don't really like literary fiction. I actually just watched recently Katie at Books and Things video on literary fiction, and she talked about commercial fiction, reading group fiction, and literary fiction, and it kind of blew my mind because I had never thought of reading group fiction as being a separate delineation between commercial and literary. And I think that when I thought I liked literary, I actually liked reading group. And that I actually find literary to be quite boring. I think that was like kind of like, I don't know, it kind of remapped the way I think of my reading taste. But we're talking about vampires here and not my taste for literary fiction or not. So I will move on. So this is another book where the vampires are not going to die because of the sun. They get burnt. Like you'll get a sunburn. Your eyes are more sensitive to the light, and that type of thing. In this one, there's like the concept that you see in Twilight of like, do I or don't I have a soul? Am I evil now? Or like, do I retain any pieces of my humanity? She also is actually kind of like Twilight vampires in that she will not eat human blood because that is her being the demon that she is. So she consumes pig's blood. She doesn't have like super strength or anything like that. As far as vampires go, overall, they seem kind of boring in this. And here you do have to be bitten, like other vampires. Yeah, and so I'm reading my notes, and I wrote, this just like a complaint I had with Dracula, vampire books aren't allowed to be boring. So I think that that's something I learned from this book. Like, I have to have action. I have to have a forward plot line with my vampire books. I don't like vampires to just exist. I want it to be fun. I want it to be alluring. I want it to be engaging. Like, I want there to be action around a vampire. I don't want to watch a vampire searching the internet looking to see how she can find pig's blood because she can't like get blood elsewhere and isn't allowed, like she's not allowing herself to be like a little dangerous and like maybe just take a taste of human. I don't know. So yeah, that one did not work. So then I read the classic to the classic. I read Carmilla. I thought this was really interesting in terms of it being a precursor to Dracula, but Dracula having a lot more of the notoriety and fame around it. I was kind of trying to go back in time to see like the earliest vampire books and their poems and other things that have vampires in them prior to Carmilla. But this is also kind of known as one of the earlier texts with them in it. I think that this, for me, probably really worked well at the time, and I did like it. I liked it through the historic lens more than I liked it through the lens of the vampires and actually, like, enjoying it just on its own. You don't know, like, it's a horror, and you don't know what she is. There's people dying, you hear about a young girl dying, you have this girl show up at this, like, gothic, old place where this man and his daughter live together, and they take her in, and they'll be like, I'll be back in 3 months for my daughter. And it's like, that's a little weird. And then there's like these weird things that like your female protagonist remembers, but she develops this very intense relationship with Carmilla, and you don't know what's going on, and you finally find out that it is a vampire story. And I think for the time, that probably worked really well. And I think for people who like that opening up of like a narrative and like being like, what is that creepy crawly? What is the big bad? That works. For me, I just want the vampires to be on the page. I don't want any question. I just want it to be a vampire book. I also thought it was really interesting from the historic context of what vampires look like in modern culture now, how the vampires were made here. And so this doesn't come until the very end of the book, so if you don't want to know, don't keep watching this part. I think it's interesting that in a lot of these, including this one, they breathe, they have a pulse, so they're alive. The way that vampires are created here, where it's people who killed themselves but were also kind of evil, end up being vampires. The connection to the grave site is something that you see in Buffy, where you see people die and then they like come back as vampires, and that's like, you know, they're always kind of around the cemeteries. That's kind of comes directly from that older culture of vampires, where these people are connected to the cemetery. So like, as long as they have a place to rest, they can keep going on. And then like the ways that you could kill them with stakes, cutting their head off, burning them, those are all ways of killing vampires that you see in a modern era. So from the historic aspect of where vampires are now, or how you see them portrayed in culture now, I found that interesting. But overall, it wasn't like, I didn't love the book. So then I read a new book called So Thirsty. This is a thriller. It takes place in upstate New York, which is where I live. And it's like this woman who's in her mid-30s who is really obsessed with her youth and like looking at her wrinkles on her face and questioning how she lived her life. And she has a best friend, and like her husband's cheating on her, and like her best friend's living like her wild life. And then they meet up for a weekend for her birthday in upstate New York, in the Finger Lakes, and things happen. And in order to talk about the vampire part about this, I really need to talk about things that happen at like the 1/3 mark. So again, maybe not the good right video for you if you don't want to be spoiled in some capacity, but what I liked about this book is that like you got to see the formation of a vampire. So you got to see someone become a vampire and like what it's like to become one. Like you go from being a human to being a vampire to eating a burger one day to now having to drink blood to quench your thirst. And in this book, vampires have a huge thirst when they are first made. I'm comparing a lot to Twilight, but follow me. I think that this book is for the teens and tweens who read and liked Twilight, who grew into adults who listen to true crime. If that's you, then this is the vampire book for you. It's like a thriller and a romance, so it has that alluring, like the vampires kind of draw you in, there's something about them, energy to it. It's thriller, it's kind of campy, it's kind of a romance. The blend between thriller and romance is like a little strange here to me, but for some people it might work. And like, to keep the Twilight thing going, like the protagonist is giving Edward. I liked like the people that like the vampires that you meet in it who like drink, like who are like not vegetarians, but consume human blood in a respectful manner. And then you're just seeing all of this destruction of new vampires and like not being able to control yourself as a new vampire. I also just want to say that the two protagonists are the most annoying people. So unlikable and annoying. So if you can't get along with really annoying protagonists, this might not be the book for you. It was kind of a book for me. Like, I liked the vampire aspects, but there's a lot of other parts that I could leave. I had another DNF, so I was like, let me try to find some books that are urban fantasy, because that's what I really liked with certain dark things. This whole video, I've been trying to chase this certain dark things high that I got, and I was never successful. So I attempted Halfway to the Grave. This is very much a book that came out when Twilight came out. Like, it's feeding off of that energy. You have it be a little bit more grown up. You're following a half vampire, and she kills vampires because of who her dad was, and then a vampire catches her doing this and then enlists her, and then it's their relationship. It's too 2000s for me, and I had to quit it. So urban fantasy, maybe. That urban fantasy that feels like it's chasing the Twilight energy, it's a no. Okay, so that's all I read for this, but these are the other books that I am considering reading. So I am currently reading the Gilda stories. I just started it. I want to read Let the Right One In. This one sounds like it's more of a horror one, and it's in Sweden. I want to read The Lesser Dead because it's 1970s New York City, so I'm hoping that gives me it scratches the same sort of itch as certain dark things. And then here's some others that I've debated reading, but I'm not sure. So there's Fledgling by Octavia Butler. That is people call it like a spin on vampires. Octavia Butler doesn't super work for me. I liked The Parable of the Sower. I couldn't really get through Kindred, and so I'm iffy about picking this one up. Interview with a Vampire, which is a classic, but I've read the premise, and I know what Anne Rice has done for the genre, okay? Like, I know what she's done for the modern vamp. I'm just, not interested. I don't know. It just seems boring to me. Vivia by Tanith Lee. I don't remember why I have this on my list. I was considering Vampires of El Norte. That had been on my list before, but it sounds kind of literary and boring, and we've already been through the fact that I do not want my vampire books to be boring, so I think that one might be axed. A comic called Vampire Hunter D. I Am Legend, which I've seen people say that the vampires in this read more like zombies than vampires, which could be interesting. It's a dystopian, so that would be a little bit different from the other books that I've attempted. I wanted to try to find books that have vampire-like characters from different cultures. So, I think that the concept of the big bad, the concept of a creature, is very culturally dependent, and the vampire as we know it in Western culture comes from the Western gaze, comes from Western books, and so it imbues itself into the culture in a specific way, and especially from the horror context, what is a culture actually scared of. So I attempted to find books that have vampires in them from different cultures, but it was actually quite challenging to attempt to find that because they won't be called vampires, they may be called something else. So then you have to figure out what they're called, then you have to see if there's books about it and make sure they're translated into English. So I attempted to pursue this and I wasn't able to get very far into that, so if anyone has any suggestions for that, I would greatly appreciate it. But that is all I have for this video. I found this to be a fun project. I think I have a better idea of what I'm looking for in a vampire text. I am looking for action. I am looking for interesting powers in my vampires. I am looking for the allure of a vampire, and I kind of just want it to be a little fun. I don't want a vampire to take itself too seriously. So, if there's any other books like that you think I will like, feel free to leave them in the comments. I would be interested in reading more vampire books, maybe not this year, but in the future. But that is all I got. So until next time, happy reading.